Section 73 of the Book of Household Management. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Household Management by Isabella Beeton. Recipes, Chapter 31, Part 1. To make syrup for compotes, etc. 1512. Ingredients. To every pound of sugar allow 1½ pint of water. Mode. Boil the sugar and water together for 1/4 hour, carefully removing the scum as it rises. The syrup is then ready for the fruit. The articles boiled in this syrup will not keep for any length of time, it being suitable only for dishes intended to be eaten immediately. A larger proportion of sugar must be added for a syrup intended to keep. Time, 1/4 hour. To clarify sugar or syrup. 1513. Ingredients. To every pound of sugar allow 1/2 pint of water and 1/2 the white of an egg. Mode. Put the sugar, water, and the white of the egg, which should be well beaten, into a preserving pan or lined saucepan, and do not put it on the fire till the sugar is dissolved. Then place it on the fire, and when it boils, throw in a teacupful of cold water, and do not stir the sugar after this is added. Bring it to the boiling point again, and then place the pan by the side of the fire, for the preparation to settle. Remove all the scum, and the sugar will be ready for use. The scum should be placed in a sieve, so that what syrup runs from it may be boiled up again. This must also be well skimmed. Time. 20 minutes for the sugar to dissolve, 5 minutes to boil. Note. The above two recipes are those used in the preparation of dishes usually made at home. There are many degrees of boiling sugar, which process requires great care, attention, and experience. Caramel sugar, which makes an elegant cover for sweetmeats, is difficult to prepare, and is best left to an experienced confectioner. We give the recipe for those of our readers who care to attempt the operation. To boil sugar to caramel. 1514. Ingredients. To every pound of lump sugar allow 1 gill of spring water. Mode. Boil the sugar and water together very quickly over a clear fire, skimming it very carefully as soon as it boils. Keep it boiling until the sugar snaps when a little of it is dropped in a pan of cold water. If it remains hard, the sugar has attained the right degree. Then squeeze in a little lemon juice, and let it remain an instant on the fire. Set the pan into another of cold water, and the caramel is then ready for use. The insides of well-oiled molds are often ornamented with this sugar, with which a fork should be spread over them in fine threads or network. A dish of light pastry, tastefully arranged, looks very prettily with this sugar spun lightly over it. The sugar must be carefully watched, and taken up the instant it is done. Unless the cook is very experienced and thoroughly understands her business, it is scarcely worth while to attempt to make this elaborate ornament, as it may be purchased quite as economically at a confectioner's, if the failures in the preparation are taken into consideration. Compote of Apples. Sawyer's Recipe, a Dessert Dish. 1515. Ingredients. 6 ripe apples, 1 lemon, 1/2 pound of lump sugar, 1/2 pint of water. [Illustration: Compote of Apples.] Mode. Select the apples of a moderate size, peel them, cut them in halves, remove the cores, and rub each piece over with a little lemon. Put the sugar and water together into a lined saucepan, and let them boil until forming a thickish syrup, when lay in the apples with the rind of the lemon cut thin, and the juice of the same. Let the apples simmer till tender. Then take them out very carefully, drain them on a sieve, and reduce the syrup by boiling it quickly for a few minutes. When both are cold, arrange the apples neatly on a glass dish, pour over the syrup, and garnish with strips of green angelica or candied citron. Smaller apples may be dressed in the same manner. They should not be divided in half, but peeled and the cores pushed out with a vegetable cutter. Time. 10 minutes to boil the sugar and water together, from 15 to 25 minutes to simmer the apples. Average cost, 6d. Sufficient for 4 or 5 persons. Seasonable from July to March. APPLE GINGER. A dessert dish. 1516. INGREDIENTS. 2 lbs of any kind of hard apples, 2 lbs of loaf sugar, 1 1/2 pint of water, 1 oz. of tincture of ginger. Mode. Boil the sugar and water until they form a rich syrup, adding the ginger when it boils up. Pare, core, and cut the apples into pieces. Dip them in cold water to preserve the colour, and boil them in the syrup until transparent, but be careful not to let them break. Put the pieces of apple into jars, pour over the syrup, and carefully exclude the air by well covering them. It will remain good some time, if kept in a dry place. Time. From 5 to 10 minutes to boil the syrup, about 1/2 hour to simmer the apples. Average cost, 2s. Sufficient for 7 or 8 persons. Seasonable. Make this in September, October, or November. APPLE JAM. 1517. INGREDIENTS. To every lb of fruit weighed after being pared, cored, and sliced, allow 3/4 lb of preserving sugar, the grated rind of 1 lemon, the juice of 1/2 lemon. Mode. Peel the apples, core and slice them very thin, and be particular that they are all the same sort. Put them into a jar, stand this in a saucepan of boiling water, and let the apples stew until quite tender. Previously to putting the fruit into the jar, weigh it, to ascertain the proportion of sugar that may be required. Put the apples into a preserving pan, crush the sugar to small lumps, and add it, with the grated lemon rind and juice, to the apples. Simmer these over the fire for 1/2 hour, reckoning from the time the jam begins to simmer properly. Remove the scum as it rises, and when the jam is done, put it into pots for use. Place a piece of oiled paper over the jam, and to exclude the air, cover the pots with tissue paper dipped in the white of an egg, and stretched over the top. This jam will keep good for a long time. Time. About 2 hours to stew in the jar, 1/2 hour to boil after the jam begins to simmer. Average cost. For this quantity, 6s. Sufficient, 7 or 8 lbs of apples for 6 pots of jam. Seasonable. Make this in September, October, or November. APPLE JELLY. 1. 1518. INGREDIENTS. To 6 lbs of apples allow 3 pints of water. To every quart of juice allow 2 lbs of loaf sugar, the juice of 1/2 lemon. Mode. Pare, core, and cut the apples into slices, and put them into a jar, with water in the above proportion. Place them in a cool oven, with the jar well covered, and when the juice is thoroughly drawn and the apples are quite soft, strain them through a jelly bag. To every quart of juice allow 2 lbs of loaf sugar, which should be crushed to small lumps, and put into a preserving pan with the juice. Boil these together for rather more than 1/2 hour, remove the scum as it rises, add the lemon juice just before it is done, and put the jelly into pots for use. This preparation is useful for garnishing sweet dishes, and may be turned out for dessert. Time. The apples to be put in the oven overnight, and left till morning, rather more than 1/2 hour to boil the jelly. Average cost. For this quantity, 3s. Sufficient for 6 small pots of jelly. Seasonable. This should be made in September, October, or November. 2. 1519. INGREDIENTS. Apples, water. To every pint of syrup allow 3/4 lb of loaf sugar. Mode. Pare and cut the apples into pieces, remove the cores, and put them into a preserving pan with sufficient cold water to cover them. Let them boil for an hour, then drain the syrup from them through a hair sieve or jelly bag, and measure the juice. To every pint allow 3/4 lb of loaf sugar, and boil these together for 3/4 hour, removing every particle of scum as it rises, and keeping the jelly well stirred, that it may not burn. A little lemon rind may be boiled with the apples, and a small quantity of strained lemon juice may be put in the jelly just before it is done, when the flavour is liked. This jelly may be ornamented with preserved greengages, or any other preserved fruit, and will turn out very prettily for dessert. It should be stored away in small pots. Time. 1 hour to boil the fruit in water, 3/4 hour to boil the juice with the sugar. Average cost, for 6 lbs of apples, with the other ingredients in proportion, 3s. Sufficient for 6 small pots of jelly. Seasonable. Make this in September, October, or November. To preserve apples in quarters, in imitation of ginger. 1520. INGREDIENTS. To every pound of apples allow 3/4 lb of sugar, 1 1/2 oz of the best white ginger, 1 oz of ginger to every 1/2 pint of water. Mode. Peel, core, and quarter the apples, and put the fruit, sugar, and ginger in layers into a wide-mouthed jar, and let them remain for 2 days. Then infuse 1 oz of ginger in 1/2 pint of boiling water, and cover it closely, and let it remain for 1 day. This quantity of ginger and water is for 3 lbs of apples, with the other ingredients in proportion. Put the apples, etc., into a preserving pan with the water strained from the ginger, and boil till the apples look clear and the syrup is rich, which will be in about an hour. The rind of a lemon may be added just before the apples have finished boiling, and great care must be taken not to break the pieces of apple in putting them into the jars. Serve on glass dishes for dessert. Time. 2 days for the apples to remain in the jar with sugar, etc. 1 day to infuse the ginger, about 1 hour to boil the apples. Average cost, for 3 lbs of apples, with the other ingredients in proportion, 2s. 3d. Sufficient. 3 lbs should fill 3 moderate-sized jars. Seasonable. This should be made in September, October, or November. Compote of Apricots, an elegant dish. 1521. INGREDIENTS. 1/2 pint of syrup No. 1512, 12 green apricots. Mode. Make the syrup by recipe No. 1512, and when it is ready, put in the apricots whilst the syrup is boiling. Simmer them very gently until tender, taking care not to let them break. Take them out carefully, arrange them on a glass dish, let the syrup cool a little, pour it over the apricots, and, when cold, serve. Time. From 15 to 20 minutes to simmer the apricots. Average cost, 9d. Sufficient for 4 or 5 persons. Seasonable in June and July with green apricots. Apricot jam or marmalade. 1522. INGREDIENTS. To every pound of ripe apricots, weighed after being skinned and stoned, allow 1 lb of sugar. Mode. Pare the apricots, which should be ripe, as thinly as possible, break them in half, and remove the stones. Weigh the fruit, and to every pound allow the same proportion of loaf sugar. Pound the sugar very finely in a mortar, strew it over the apricots, which should be placed on dishes, and let them remain for 12 hours. Break the stones, blanch the kernels, and put them with the sugar and fruit into the preserving pan. Let these simmer very gently until clear. Take out the pieces of apricot singly as they become so, and, as fast as the scum rises, carefully remove it. Put the apricots into small jars, pour over them the syrup and kernels, cover the jam with pieces of paper dipped in the purest salad oil, and stretch over the top of the jars tissue paper, cut about 2 inches larger, and brushed over with the white of an egg. When dry, it will be perfectly hard and air-tight. Time. 12 hours sprinkled with sugar, about 3/4 hour to boil the jam. Average cost. When cheap, apricots may be purchased for preserving at about 1s. 6d. per gallon. Sufficient. 10 lbs of fruit for 12 pots of jam. Seasonable. Make this in August or September. Barberries in bunches. 1523. INGREDIENTS. 1 pint of syrup No. 1513, barberries. Mode. Prepare some small pieces of clean white wood, 3 inches long and 1/4 inch wide, and tie the fruit onto these in nice bunches. Have ready some clear syrup, made by recipe No. 1513. Put in the barberries, and simmer them in it for 2 successive days, boiling them for nearly 1/2 hour each day, and covering them each time with the syrup when cold. When the fruit looks perfectly clear, it is sufficiently done, and should be stored away in pots, with the syrup poured over, or the fruit may be candied. Time. 1/2 hour to simmer each day. Seasonable. In autumn. Note. The berries in their natural state make a very pretty garnishing for dishes, and may even be used for the same purpose, preserved as above, and look exceedingly nice on sweet dishes. To make barley sugar. 1524. INGREDIENTS. To every pound of sugar allow 1/2 pint of water, 1/2 the white of an egg. Mode. Put the sugar into a well-tinned saucepan, with the water, and, when the former is dissolved, set it over a moderate fire, adding the well-beaten egg before the mixture gets warm, and stir it well together. When it boils, remove the scum as it rises, and keep it boiling until no more appears, and the syrup looks perfectly clear. Then strain it through a fine sieve or muslin bag, and put it back into the saucepan. Boil it again like caramel, until it is brittle, when a little is dropped in a basin of cold water. It is then sufficiently boiled. Add a little lemon juice and a few drops of essence of lemon, and let it stand for a minute or two. Have ready a marble slab or large dish, rubbed over with salad oil. Pour on it the sugar, and cut it into strips with a pair of scissors. These strips should then be twisted, and the barley sugar stored away in a very dry place. It may be formed into lozenges or drops by dropping the sugar in a very small quantity at a time onto the oiled slab or dish. Time 1/4 hour. Average cost 7d. Sufficient for 5 or 6 sticks. Carrot jam to imitate apricot preserve. 1525. INGREDIENTS. Carrots. To every pound of carrot pulp allow 1 pound of pounded sugar, the grated rind of 1 lemon, the strained juice of 2, 6 chopped bitter almonds, 2 tablespoonfuls of brandy. Mode. Select young carrots, wash and scrape them clean, cut them into round pieces, put them into a saucepan with sufficient water to cover them, and let them simmer until perfectly soft; then beat them through a sieve. Weigh the pulp, and to every pound allow the above ingredients. Put the pulp into a preserving pan with the sugar, and let this boil for 5 minutes, stirring and skimming all the time. When cold, add the lemon rind and juice, almonds and brandy. Mix these well with the jam; then put it into pots, which must be well covered and kept in a dry place. The brandy may be omitted, but the preserve will then not keep. With the brandy, it will remain good for months. Time. About 3/4 hour to boil the carrots, 5 minutes to simmer the pulp. Average cost, 1s. 2d. for 1 pound of pulp, with the other ingredients in proportion. Sufficient to fill 3 pots. Seasonable from July to December. To make cherry brandy. 1536. INGREDIENTS. Morella cherries, good brandy. To every pound of cherries allow 3 ounces of pounded sugar. Mode. Have ready some glass bottles, which must be perfectly dry. Ascertain that the cherries are not too ripe, and are freshly gathered, and cut off about half of the stalks. Put them into the bottles, with the above proportion of sugar to every pound of fruit, strew this in between the cherries, and, when the bottles are nearly full, pour in sufficient brandy to reach just below the cork. A few peach or apricot kernels will add much to their flavour, or a few blanched bitter almonds. Put corks or bungs into the bottles, tie over them a piece of bladder, and store away in a dry place. The cherries will be fit to eat in 2 or 3 months, and will remain good for years. They are liable to shrivel and become tough if too much sugar be added to them. Average cost, 1s. to 1s. 6d. per pound. Sufficient, 1 pound of cherries and about 1/4 pint of brandy for a quart bottle. Seasonable in August and September. Dried cherries. 1527. Cherries may be put on a slow oven and thoroughly dried before they begin to change colour. They should then be taken out of the oven, tied in bunches, and stored away in a dry place. In the winter they may be cooked with sugar for dessert, the same as Normandy pippins. Particular care must be taken that the oven be not too hot. Another method of drying cherries is to stone them, and to put them into a preserving pan with plenty of loaf sugar strewed amongst them. They should be simmered till the fruit shrivels, when they should be strained from the juice. The cherries should then be placed in an oven, cool enough to dry without baking them. About 5 ounces of sugar would be required for 1 pound of cherries, and the same syrup may be used again to do another quantity of fruit. Cherry Jam. 1528. INGREDIENTS. To every pound of fruit, weighed before stoning, allow 1/2 pound of sugar; to every 6 pounds of fruit, allow 1 pint of red currant juice, and to every pint of juice 1 pound of sugar. Mode. Weigh the fruit before stoning, and allow half the weight of sugar; stone the cherries, and boil them in a preserving pan until nearly all the juice is dried up; then add the sugar, which should be crushed to powder, and the currant juice, allowing 1 pint to every 6 pounds of cherries, original weight, and 1 pound of sugar to every pint of juice. Boil all together until it jellies, which will be in from 20 minutes to 1/2 hour. Skim the jam well, keep it well stirred, and, a few minutes before it is done, crack some of the stones and add the kernels. These impart a very delicious flavour to the jam. Time. According to the quality of the cherries, from 3/4 to 1 hour to boil them, 20 minutes to 1/2 hour with the sugar. Average cost, from 7d. to 8d. per pound pot. Sufficient. 1 pint of fruit for a pound pot of jam. Seasonable. Make this in July or August. To preserve cherries in syrup. Very delicious. 1529. INGREDIENTS. 4 lbs. of cherries, 3 lbs. of sugar, 1 pint of white currant juice. Mode. Let the cherries be as clear and as transparent as possible, and perfectly ripe. Pick off the stalks, and remove the stones, damaging the fruit as little as you can. Make a syrup with the above proportion of sugar, by recipe No. 1512. Mix the cherries with it, and boil them for about 15 minutes, carefully skimming them. Turn them gently into a pan, and let them remain till the next day. Then drain the cherries on a sieve, and put the syrup and white currant juice into the preserving pan again. Boil these together until the syrup is somewhat reduced and rather thick. Then put in the cherries, and let them boil for about 5 minutes. Take them off the fire, skim the syrup, put the cherries into small pots or wide-mouthed bottles. Pour the syrup over, and when quite cold, tie them down carefully, so that the air is quite excluded. Time. 15 minutes to boil the cherries in the syrup, 10 minutes to boil the syrup and currant juice, 6 minutes to boil the cherries the second time. Average cost. For this quantity, 3s. 6d. Seasonable. Make this in July or August. Black currant jam. 1530. INGREDIENTS. To every pound of fruit, weighed before being stripped from the stalks, allow 3/4 lb. of loaf sugar, 1 gill of water. Mode. Let the fruit be very ripe, and gathered on a dry day. Strip it from the stalks, and put it into a preserving pan, with a gill of water to each pound of fruit. Boil these together for 10 minutes. Then add the sugar, and boil the jam again for 30 minutes, reckoning from the time when the jam simmers equally all over, or longer should it not appear to set nicely when a little is poured on to a plate. Keep stirring it to prevent it from burning, carefully remove all the scum, and when done, pour it into pots. Let it cool, cover the top of the jam with oiled paper, and the top of the jars with a piece of tissue paper brushed over on all sides with the white of an egg. This, when cold, forms a hard stiff cover, and perfectly excludes the air. Great attention must be paid to the stirring of this jam, as it is very liable to burn, on account of the thickness of the juice. Time. 10 minutes to boil the fruit and water, 30 minutes with the sugar, or longer. Average cost, from 6d. to 8d. for a pot capable of holding 1 pound. Sufficient. Allow from 6 to 7 quarts of currants to make 1 dozen pots of jam, each pot to hold 1 pound. Seasonable. Make this in July. Black currant jelly. 1531. INGREDIENTS. Black currants, To every pint of juice allow 1/4 pint of water, 1 lb. of loaf sugar. Mode. Strip the currants from the stalks, which may be done in an expeditious manner by holding the bunch in one hand and passing a small silver fork down the currants. They will then readily fall from the stalks. Put them into a jar, place this jar in a saucepan of boiling water, and simmer them until their juice is extracted. Then strain them, and to every pint of juice allow the above proportion of sugar and water. Stir these ingredients together cold until the sugar is dissolved. Place the preserving pan on the fire, and boil the jelly for about 1/2 hour, reckoning from the time it commences to boil all over, and carefully remove the scum as it rises. If the jelly becomes firm when a little is put on a plate, it is done. It should then be put into small pots, and covered the same as the jam in the preceding recipe. If the jelly is wanted very clear, the fruit should not be squeezed dry; but of course, so much juice will not be obtained. If the fruit is not much squeezed, it may be converted into a jam for immediate eating, by boiling it with a little common sugar. This answers very well for a nursery preserve. Time. About 3/4 hour to extract the juice, 1/2 hour to boil the jelly. Average cost, from 8d. to 10d. per 1/2 lb. pot. Sufficient, from 3 pints to 2 quarts of fruit should yield a pint of juice. Seasonable. Make this in July. RED CURRANT JAM. 1532. INGREDIENTS. To every lb. of fruit allow 3/4 lb. of loaf sugar. [Illustration: Jam pot.] Mode. Let the fruit be gathered on a fine day. Weigh it, and then strip the currants from the stalks. Put them into a preserving pan with sugar in the above proportion. Stir them, and boil them for about 3/4 hour. Carefully remove the scum as it rises. Put the jam into pots, and, when cold, cover with oiled papers. Over these put a piece of tissue paper brushed over on both sides with the white of an egg. Press the paper around the top of the pot, and, when dry, the covering will be quite hard and air-tight. Time. 1/2 to 3/4 hour, reckoning from the time the jam boils all over. Average cost, for a pound pot, from 6d. to 8d. Sufficient. Allow from 6 to 7 quarts of currants to make 12 1 lb. pots of jam. Seasonable. Make this in July. RED CURRANT JELLY. 1533. INGREDIENTS. Red currants. To every pint of juice allow 3/4 lb. of loaf sugar. Mode. Have the fruit gathered in fine weather. Pick it from the stalks, put it into a jar, and place this jar in a saucepan of boiling water over the fire, and let it simmer gently until the juice is well drawn from the currants. Then strain them through a jelly bag or fine cloth, and, if the jelly is wished very clear, do not squeeze them too much, as the skin and pulp from the fruit will be pressed through with the juice, and so make the jelly muddy. Measure the juice, and to each pint allow 3/4 lb. of loaf sugar. Put these into a preserving pan, set it over the fire, and keep stirring the jelly until it is done, carefully removing every particle of scum as it rises, using a wooden or silver spoon for the purpose, as metal or iron ones would spoil the colour of the jelly. When it has boiled from 20 minutes to 1/2 hour, put a little of the jelly on a plate, and if firm when cool, it is done. Take it off the fire, pour it into small gallipots, cover each of the pots with an oiled paper, and then with a piece of tissue paper brushed over on both sides with the white of an egg. Label the pots, adding the year when the jelly was made, and store it away in a dry place. A jam may be made with the currants, if they are not squeezed too dry, by adding a few fresh raspberries, and boiling all together, with sufficient sugar to sweeten it nicely. As this preserve is not worth storing away, but is only for immediate eating, a smaller proportion of sugar than usual will be found enough. It answers very well for children's puddings, or for a nursery preserve. Time. From 3/4 to 1 hour to extract the juice, 20 minutes to 1/2 hour to boil the jelly. Average cost, from 8d. to 10d. per 1/2 lb. pot. Sufficient. 8 quarts of currants will make from 10 to 12 pots of jelly. Seasonable. Make this in July. Note. Should the above proportion of sugar not be found sufficient for some tastes, add an extra 1/4 lb. to every pint of juice, making altogether 1 lb. WHITE CURRANT JELLY. 1534. INGREDIENTS. White currants; to every pint of juice allow 3/4 lb. of good loaf sugar. Mode. Pick the currants from the stalks, and put them into a jar; place this jar in a saucepan of boiling water, and simmer until the juice is well drawn from the fruit, which will be in from 3/4 to 1 hour. Then strain the currants through a fine cloth or jelly bag; do not squeeze them too much, or the jelly will not be clear, and put the juice into a very clean preserving pan, with the sugar. Let this simmer gently over a clear fire until it is firm, and keep stirring and skimming until it is done; then pour it into small pots, cover them, and store away in a dry place. Time. 3/4 hour to draw the juice, 1/2 hour to boil the jelly. Average cost, from 8d. to 10d. per 1/2 lb. pot. Sufficient. From 3 pints to 2 quarts of fruit should yield 1 pint of juice. Seasonable in July and August. Section 73.